welcome back. We are having our first conversation this morning, and as we mentioned, it's all about the 5 C's on climate change, hurricanes, and heat waves. And we have here with us the Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, Dr. Colin Young, to talk to us about it. Good morning, Dr. Young. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
All right. Great. Thank you so much for stopping by and, of course, having this conversation with us. Perhaps we can begin with a bit of an update on what's currently taking place over at the 5 C's.
So good morning, and thanks to Channel 5 for having me once again, and of course to the listening and viewing public. The 5 C's, as we know, is a regional CARICOM institution that has a mandate from the heads of governments of the 15 CARICOM countries to coordinate the region's response on climate change. As part of that mandate, we are continuously working with these countries to help them to make evidence-based decisions from the data and information that we would collect about climate and weather. And we also assist the countries in helping to mobilize money to make interventions and find solutions to some of the impacts from climate change. Right. And we've been relatively successful at doing that. In fact, recently you may have heard that the 5 C's, in partnership with the government of Belize, was able to secure a $50 million grant to help build the resilience of sugarcane farmers in the north to the effects of climate change. So in the sugar industry, you either in some instances have too much water and there are floods, and in those instances then you have to deal with drainage. In many other instances you have too little water, there's droughts, and because of the increased temperature that is caused from global warming, which manifests itself in the climate changing, you also have increased pests and diseases. So that project is looking at how to improve some of the interventions to make the sugar industry more resilient to climate change.
What made that look like? It's $15 million. Are you aware of also how that money will be spread across the industry? Who will manage that?
So it's being managed by the 5 C's, and there are the 4 farmer associations in the north that are the beneficiaries of the project. The Belize Sugar Industry Association also has a very important role to play. They're also a co-finance provider along with the 4 associations also providing co-financing. And CERDI is also involved. The Ministry of Agriculture is involved. So it's many partners who are working to essentially look at different varieties of sugarcane seedlings that they would plant that will be able to respond in different climatic conditions with the same kind of productivity that would decrease the impact of diseases and pests, and that would respond to whether we have too much water, too little. So there's be nurseries set up, there'll be drainage that will be done, a lot of capacity building that will happen with the farmers. Now outside the region, outside Belize, we have several projects, over $140 million in projects actually, that we're investing in some of the countries with our donors. We're building hurricane shelters using renewable energy to provide reliable sources of power if the power was to go. In Barbados, we are looking at water. How do we ensure that people have reliable supplies of water using renewable energy if the storm knocks out the electrical grid? So those are types of interventions that we are doing. We're installing automatic weather stations across the region to provide the Met offices in the various countries with information that they can use to help in their forecasting and things like that. So
is the need for climate resilience in the farming sector unique to Belize?
No.
Within the region, that is?
No, it is, in fact, climate change has a significant and serious impact on agriculture. Why? Because the majority of our farmers across the region rely on rain-fed agriculture. And one of the biggest impacts of climate change is that the variability of when the rain comes and how much rain comes changes significantly. So our farmers have been, because over generations, you know that the rainy season normally comes June, right? June 1st to November 30th, we think of that as the hurricane season because the rains come. And what is happening in some years, you see that the rains either don't come at all in June until much later.
The prediction is harder to make.
Or they come a lot earlier. So imagine that if you are planting your crops in May or late May, waiting for the rains to come to help those crops grow, and then you have a 2-month drought or delay in the rainy season, those crops could die.
Yeah.
Right. So that is why it's so difficult, and across the region you have that same issue.
Yeah.
And then of course there are some countries like Antigua and Barbuda, for example, where they've been ongoing a serious drought, 3 years or more. We've had serious droughts in Belize too before that caused millions of dollars in losses to farming. So that's a particularly vulnerable sector.
I think we oftentimes overlook the agricultural sector when we're having the conversation of climate change. And I say so because I remember, I believe it was just a few weeks ago where we were celebrating World Meteorology Day, and that was a conversation that we were having where climate change and monitoring weather developments, how it impacts several sectors, including the agriculture sector. There's obviously the aerospace, where persons working at airlines, they rely on climate updates to find out when is suitable to travel. Persons that are traveling on the sea as well, it's so important for them to know too. But obviously that's one side of the conversation when it comes to climate change. I think another is, though, the public would like to know what has been the biggest concern here in Belize locally as it relates to climate developments?
Well, I think Belize is, because of our geography, is very vulnerable to being hit by a hurricane. Right? And the damage from the hurricane obviously is very significant. We go back, if we go all the way back to 1960, 61 hurricane, you know, the damage of that hurricane back then was equivalent to 300% of its GDP, right? And then we've had Hurricane Keith, and we have other large hurricanes, and recently we've been quite fortunate where even though we get Category 1 hurricanes, there's still millions of dollars in damages. But the probability and the likelihood of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes are getting higher and higher because the ocean temperatures are getting warmer and warmer. So we are squarely in the hurricane belt. That is always, I think, every June to November, Belizeans hold their breaths and hoping that we will be spared a devastating hurricane. But we also have the effects of forest fires because the temperature is so warm, and I think you've heard the Belize Met Office, they do a fantastic job with the forecasts, talking about the heat waves. Now, if you're having heat waves, it also means that the land is drying up a bit, and so forests now can burn. And because people tend to burn their fields in preparation for the rains coming in June, and the temperatures are so hot, it's more likely that those fires escape, and then they cause the smoke situation, they cause the health situation that we hear about so often in the north and in the west. And then recently there's been a big focus on human health and heat stress.
Yes.
Because if you happen to work outside and you have really high temperatures, over 100 degrees, with relatively high humidity, which you know makes you sort of cool down less, then if you're doing outside work, people get heat stress and you could get heat stroke. And so there is now a focus on conditions under which people should not be asked to work if the temperatures are so high. So health, certainly hurricanes, forest fires. And then I want to spend a little time on the oceans, because sometimes we forget about what climate change can do to the oceans. The same way that the temperature on land is increasing, we have heat waves happening in the sea as well. And so, and this can segue into the conversations about hurricanes. So when temperatures in the ocean get warm, then just like how humans struggle to deal with the effects of high temperature, our corals respond the same way. They get stressed. So as the ocean temperature is getting warmer and warmer, corals live in a very narrow band of temperature, and once it gets above that, they start to get stressed. And when they get stressed, like humans, they're more likely to get sick. And one of the things that they do is that they become bleached, right? They become white color. And that's because they kick out the algae that they have a relationship with that gives them that nice, beautiful color. The algae provides photosynthesis, provides food for the corals, and then when they're stressed, they kick it out, they get white, and eventually they could die.
So where are we with that? What are we seeing right now? Is it at a point of extremity?
Well, what we are seeing is that as the temperatures warm in the oceans, that the incidences of bleaching events increase. And what that does on a large scale is that it can impact our tourism industry, it can impact our fishing industry, and the livelihoods of the fishers that depend on the fish stocks. So we see this very clearly in the years when the temperatures are the warmest, when also land temperatures are also the warmest, we see massive events of corals, of bleached corals. So you may have heard, and I try to avoid from the sort of doomsday scenario, but one of the things that Belize as a country and the Caribbean does when we go to the COPs, the annual COPs, this issue of 1.5 to stay alive is predominant, where we're asking the developed countries to do more faster to stop the world from getting to this critical temperature, because if you get to 1.5 degrees increase in global temperatures, the projections are that 90% of our coral reefs may die. Right? That's I mean, that's a massive impact that we'll have on our economy, on our people, on our life, the biodiversity of the sea. And so that is why we want those who are most responsible for putting all of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to do more to cut those emissions.
Put the importance of the corals into context for us so that we understand the impact of 90% of our coral reef dying.
Well, coral reefs are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. And they depend, it's the areas where a lot of the fish would spawn and where they live, and they're critical to the fishing and tourism sector. So 90%, coral reefs occur in a band across the world where the temperatures are favorable and the conditions are favorable. So the fact that we're talking about 90% of coral reefs globally, that this is a massive impact. Now at 2 degrees, if we were to go to 2 degrees, then it goes to 99%. Now we have a project with Global Affairs Canada at the 5 Seas, and Belize is one of the beneficiary countries, where we are working with an organization down south, Fragments of Hope. They're doing some fantastic work where they're looking at transplanting resilient varieties of coral. So those that survive these bleaching events, you might find that a couple of them are surviving. They try to replant, grow those in an underwater nursery, and then replant them on the reef. So there are initiatives that people are trying to do to help mitigate against the effects of climate change.
Dr. Young, you spoke really briefly about Belize's involvement at the Conference of the Parties. And those are conferences that you would have also made presence at or attendance at. How successful would you say, or how impactful would you say, has it been on Belize as it relates to the presence that we repeatedly make at these events?
So presence is absolutely important, right? I can't underscore the importance of being present, and being present in a way that you can adequately represent the interests of the country. And I think Belize's participation has been quite commendable, because the COP is a massive event, 195 countries. There are all topics, all types of topics that are being discussed. And being in the room and inputting and making inputs to craft language that can help catalyze climate action, I think is very important. And so the Caribbean as a whole, that is what we do. The 5 Seas role in all of this is that we bring the countries together a couple times of the year, the negotiators and the climate change ministers from all of the countries, to look at what is on the agenda of the COP, of the Conference of Parties. And as a region, we decide what CARICOM's priority is going to be. And then our ministers and our prime ministers and presidents, and when they go, they lobby and they advocate for global action relating to those points. But if you're not in the room, your perspectives and your ideas and your demands are not being heard nor listened to. So it's very important for President.
What would you say are some of the projects that have materialized outside of these conferences, though? Because oftentimes the presents that are made at the conference of the parties, it is reinforced more than once that we don't want it to be a talk shop. We don't want it to be a place that we come and we congregate, we write a document and we talk about things that should be done, but it never really materializes. A lot of countries that do have the finances are still struggling to put the money where their mouth is. So what are the projects that you would say you've seen materialize on Belize's side?
Well, I think the COP, first a clarification. So the COP is really a negotiation process. And we negotiate, the countries negotiate for developed countries, for example, to put more money into the climate funds or to make more monies available to help countries like Belize to adapt to the effects of climate change. So there's not a project per se that will come out of the COP. But when governments decide to put monies into the Green Climate Fund or to the Adaptation Fund, or when the UK decides to provide bilateral support to a country in respect to a decision that was made at the COP, then that's how monies would flow. So the COP is not a place you go to and out of the COP. There is a direct project to a country. For example, at the last COP, the whole issue of the loss and damage fund, right? That was the big ticket item that CARICOM countries wanted. And the announcement at the COP was the fund was operationalized. There was about $700 million that was put into it. And then this year now, there's a board that was constituted that will decide how that fund will be operationalized and how is it that you can apply for monies and how you can get and how much you can get. And by the time you actually get some money, you're probably looking at maybe another, hopefully by COP29, the rules would have been set. So soon thereafter, when countries suffer loss and damage from climate change, they can get some money, right? So the COP is negotiating future action, and I like to tell people to get a little appreciation of this. If we were to take 195 of our friends and we put them in one room and we say, guys, where are we going to eat today? Right? And what is it that we want to eat? You will have a hard time because it's consensus. So 195 of us have to agree on what we're going to eat, what time we're going to eat, and where we're going to eat. So imagine 195 countries, some of them with very different priorities than that Belize might have, that entire CARICOM countries might have. So it's difficult. But what the rules that are set at the COP governs future actions by those countries that are most responsible for
And one would
change.
imagine that these conversations are very data-driven.
Some of them are data-driven, but I mean, to be quite frank, it's also very geopolitical and political, right? I mean, the positions that some of our developed countries take, while it's underlined by economics and money, there's also issues that are squarely political. I mean, the relationship, for example, between the developed countries and China. China being, one of the largest developing countries that now is leading the emissions of greenhouse gases. The U.S. is still the historical leader, but China is now the current leader. So one of the big fights is that why should developed countries put money into a fund, for example, that China can benefit from, right? And so there are some of those considerations. And of course, we know that there are some countries in the world which the West don't necessarily agree with. So, and then there's other countries, India, for example, the bigger developing countries, Mexico, Brazil, where developed countries are saying, you know what, you are big enough to be able to do some of these things, you should be doing more. And those countries are saying, wait a minute, we're not the ones that are responsible for climate change. You guys, meaning the G7 primarily, are the biggest emitters. And so there's a lot of that sort of tension. But as imperfect as the Conference of Parties is, it is still the best avenue that countries like Belize and smaller countries have to negotiate and have a say in governing how is it that we're going to deal with this existential issue of climate change.
And that's where I wanted to bring back the conversation, because we could spend a lot of time talking about what happens in the negotiation room, but at the end of the day, it's real people on the ground feeling real impact. And we were talking about the oceans, and one of the influences that the ocean has on the environment leads to hurricanes. Let's talk a bit about the relationship between the warming up of the oceans and hurricanes, and how we expect that to possibly impact the region in this hurricane season.
Well, as you're absolutely right, Paul, one of the biggest impacts of warming temperatures is, in fact, stronger hurricanes when they do occur. So maybe I can start by saying that obviously if the land is warming, then the same sun that is warming the land is warming the oceans, right? And normally the hurricane season is from June 1st to November 31st, but a critical part of why we have those months is because the water temperature in the North Atlantic, the tropical Atlantic where hurricanes form, gets to about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And so at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, hurricanes are more, and thunderstorms are more likely to form, right? So what we're seeing now is that the ocean temperatures in that band of oceans, pretty much from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to West Africa, it's unusually warm.
Way before June.
Way before June. In fact, the temperatures we're seeing in that part of the ocean now is typical of what happens at the end of June, July.
Wow.
So it's already above normal, right? And it's been that way for over a year. And this is one of the signs why the meteorologists, and I heard Chief Met and the National Hurricane Center and Colorado State University and others saying, you know what, these are worrying signs.
Yeah.
Because we know that when you have warm water, what is happening then, to just a little bit of it, is that warm water eventually is going to evaporate into water vapor, which means that there's more moisture in the air. And the heat that is in the ocean is going to also be going into the air, and that provides the energy for when the storms are moving across the ocean and they find these favorable conditions and they turn into tropical storms and then hurricanes. And what's really scary, that is exacerbated, made worse because of climate change, is the rapid intensification that we're starting to see happening more frequently because of these warming oceans. So Belizeans may not have spent a lot of time thinking about Hurricane Otis that hit Acapulco last year, but what was amazing about that hurricane is that it went from a tropical storm at 35 miles per hour to a Category 5 hurricane at 165 miles an hour in less than 24 hours. Right? So that's like a nightmare scenario, because imagine you going to sleep and the advice that we're getting is that this is a tropical storm, and over the next 12 hours when you wake up, it's already a powerful Category 3 or 4 or 5 hurricane. There's little time to warn anybody. There's little time to evacuate anybody. There's little time for you to secure your belongings. And so there's a recent publication that came out that suggested that it is now 2 times more likely today for a weak Category 1 hurricane to rapidly intensify to a Category 3 hurricane than when we're in the 1970 to the 1990 period. So it's getting, and that's why I think the predictions for this year is that we will have 23 named storms.
Yes.
11 of them will turn into a hurricane.
And 5 major.
5 major. Now, that's an early prediction that we hope doesn't materialize, but we don't, there's nothing in there that is telling us where these storms will form and where will they go.
Yeah.
So obviously you just need one bad one and you'd have significant impact. So we're hoping that by the time we get closer to the hurricane season, there would be other forecasts, but everything seems to be pointing to one conclusion. It's going to be a very, very active season.
Is there a possibility that we may have to expand our hurricane season from before June?
That's a very interesting question. I think one that we should ask the Met Office and Chief Met Gordon. But what we do know is that we're seeing hurricanes developing outside of the hurricane season. Because why? Those water temperatures are favorable to hurricane development.
It tells me that we should spend more time as citizens looking at the water temperatures. As much as we look at hurricane systems, you could also follow, okay, what's the temperature in our water, just to kind of get an idea. Is there a possibility of water temperatures cooling down as a positive effect?
Yes, in fact, one of the cooler the water temperatures are, obviously, and if it gets below that 80 degrees Fahrenheit, it's unlikely, it's more unlikely for hurricanes to develop. And so, I mean, anything that has a net decrease on temperatures is going to help in that respect. But the signs are that everything unless there's some massive event that occurs that releases a lot of cooling into the atmosphere that then cools the ocean. It's very difficult. So you've seen people experimenting, for example, with a technology that can try to, like these massive pumps, that what they're trying to do is take cold water from deep in the ocean
and
bring it up to the surface. But the applicability and the cost of scaling this up to the point where, in our view, is that it is a lot more cheaper and affordable to look at cutting back the emissions, right, than to look at things like that. So I think it's hard, Paul, to know the temperature when you're in it. Right? If you go to the sea today in San Pedro and you're swimming, and then you go back next month, you may not pick up that it's 2 degrees warmer, right? But because it's subtle.
Yeah.
But when it gets to the point where it's even hotter, that Hurricane Otis that intensified from 35 to 165, the water temperature over the path it was going was 88 degrees. That's like bath water. Right? I mean, it's like in a tub that you're taking in the winter, and you're taking a bath, right? It's quite hot. So at some point, if you're in a shallow enough part of the sea, you can feel that the temperature is warm. But the corals and other organisms that live permanently there, these small increases in temperature, they're very, very sensitive.
It's significant to them.
As we wrap up the conversation, what's your advice to Belizeans heading into the hurricane season? 6 weeks away.
Yeah, I think the Met Office did a fantastic job. You know, these storms, there are predictions. There's no certainty as to where they're going to go and how strong they will get. But take it as early advice to prepare yourselves. Don't wait until the appointed time, as we say, to get ready. You have a few weeks to get ready in terms of the official start of the hurricane season, and start to look at your hurricane plans, start to know where you're going to go, start to know how you're going to prepare and have your supplies, check your roofs, any little repairs that you had that you were putting off, try to get them. Because as we know, sometimes we also focus on the hurricanes, but you don't need a hurricane to have significant damage.
That's true.
Right? You can have a strong tropical storm, or you could have a big flood. We've had like Tropical Depression 16, for example, because a lot of the damage from hurricanes don't necessarily come from winds, right? They come from the water. They come from the tidal, the tidal waves that we see. We all experienced that with the last hurricane in Vista del Mar and other places like that. So we have to realize that yes, hurricanes are the biggest and baddest entities in this space, but you don't need hurricanes to have significant damage. So we could have strong winds, we can have a lot of rain, and then from a climate change point of view, a lot of drought. So what we are doing, and we have a number of projects with the government of Belize, well over $100 million US that we're working to try to access to build the resilience of Belizeans to the effects of climate change. Because ultimately, you know what, most people don't care if the temperature is increased by 1 degree or 1.1. What they want is to, how can you help me to minimize the effects of climate change? And that is, I think, we have to remember that ultimately we're talking about people and their lives, and the efforts that we can do to help that. And so that is what guides the 5 Cs in the work that we're doing with these 15 countries across CARICOM, is building the resilience of people and the livelihoods of our people.
And there's a whole nother conversation to be had there about reducing risks, especially in coastal areas, building codes, reinforcing homes,
Yes.
etc. There's a big conversation to be had there. But Dr. Young, we are out of time, and I want to thank you so much for joining us on set this morning to have this very important conversation.
And thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to take a really quick break, and when we come back, the conversation switches into the traffic department's new traffic regulations. Stay with us. We'll be right back.